In this video, I wanted to show how to add a runtime setting to the YT test module. Unlike previous videos, I'm going to use GNU Screen here, so it may be a little bit harder to follow. Try to not get too complicated in my navigation of the code. So we have this module. It does threaded rendering, but it has no ability to take settings from the command line. Let's just take some boilerplate from checkers, and what we're going to do is add the ability to specify a color, because YT test, all it does is, like shown here, it fills the fragment with white. So let's make white a runtime setting so you can specify something other than white. All you really need to do is add a setup function. So we're going to steal this. We'll grab all this too for now. Replace checkers with YT test. And we're just going to take color. So far so good. Now look for fill color here. We basically want the same thing here. So this till settings get and describe setting comes from libtil. It's just one of the helpers, one of the many helpers. So the way settings work in rototiller, if you want to have your settings randomizable, you provide a random helper that will return a random value, unless the setting is one of multiple choice. Like here in checkers, there's a whole bunch of multiple choice ones. Like the size of the checker, pattern, all these are multiple choice. When they're multiple choice, the randomizer can just figure it out on its own. But with color, we're not going to do a multiple choice. We're just going to let arbitrary RGB values work. So one option is to just remove the random, and then the randomizer won't randomize anything, and it'll just always use the preferred value. But let's give it a randomizer. So for checkers, it's just from this list. Let's not do that, but let's just take the function. That needs to be up here. Well, not there, but here. And instead, let's see, it's an RGB triplet, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And let's see, what we want is we'll just RGB. and our GNU. Nothing too fancy, but we need these to be 0 padded. So it's going to be 0 and 2, right? There we go, YT test random color. And there's one more thing. And it's in the baking. So down here, if res setup, we bake the setup, which means we allocate a setup structure that contains the native typed form of the setup. Because what happens in the first phase of the setup process is it's just constructing a key value pair array, basically. And then in the last step, once all of the required settings have been fulfilled, the setup gets baked, and that's when res setup is not null. So we're going to need a type def for a YT test setup structure. Let's assume that happens. And we don't need a free function because this is going to be a really simple setup. And we do need this. So what till setup new does is it allocates a new till setup structure of size right here, which is going to be the size of the YT setup type def, which I haven't created yet. And you pass it in the settings that you're operating on, and for now that is mostly just to get a path assigned to the setup, because all these resources have paths associated with them that are all programmatically generative. So the thing to do now is fill color, turn that into a native type, a UN32. And this is just a little wrapper that cleans up the return paths. We don't really need to worry about how it's implemented right now. It's pretty simple. And when you're finished, you just return the resulting setup. And that's basically it for the setup, but we are going to need this. Now another thing that needs to happen is you need to embed the till setup T. And it has to be at the start of the structure. So at this point, the only thing we need to do is pull the color out of the setup instance and use it here. It's going to be context, setup, color. So till module context contains a reference to the setup that the context was created with. Now, in this method, or rather this module, we don't have a context create. Like in checkers here, there's a create context and a destroy context. Because checkers has more complex state, it needs to do all this stuff when it creates a context. This is the function responsible for creating the context, and it receives the setup. But since we don't have a custom context of our own for YT test, we just have prepare frame or render fragment, and we also now have the setup. But we don't create our own context. libtil is going to just create an empty context that only contains the bare minimum of a till module context, which still gets a reference on the setup. So we have the setup. We don't really have to create a context if we don't need it. But we do have to do this little typecast because this type for the attached setup is just going to be a till setup t pointer. We can actually look at that. See, here's till module context, and there's the setup. Till setup t. Now that's why you have to have the till setup t as the first member of the setup struct, because they share the starting address. So we cast it to YT test setup t, and then we can get the color. And we have the color here now. Let's just use it. And we still need to define the default. We'll just put it up here. Which we use here. And we'll leave it white. That should do it, I think. Let's build. Like I said, I'm going to be using GNU Screen, so when I switch back and forth, I'm just switching screen windows. So what did I get here? YT test setup undeclared, 144. So this needs to be moved. Just do this. Get our declaration up here. Control reaches end of non-void 103. That terminates the setup process. Let's see, return 0. Okay, so now it's asking me for the color. Let's try red. Let's try just the defaults. It should be white. It is white. Okay. So that's how much work is involved in just adding a setting. This is a really simple setting because it's just a color. It doesn't really get simpler than this, although one could omit this stuff, the random. That would be basically as simple as it gets, as minimalist as it gets. But what you lose by removing the random is this ability. So let's do module equals RTV, channels equals YT test, duration equals, let's just do 1, context, duration equals 1, defaults, go. Now that should change colors every second. Since I provided a random function to return a random color, when RTV changes channels, and the only channel that it is switching to is YT test, it randomizes the setup. As you can see right here, the color is changing. We can actually make it go faster by changing these to 0. 0 is kind of a special case where it'll always show at least a single frame. So it's just going to be constantly changing the colors. In some sense, you can view the RTV module as a fuzzer for your modules, at least with regards to the runtime settings. Now, if I were to save this without the random function for returning the random color, and we rerun RTV with YT test, it's just always white. This is the same invocation. It should be changing the color every frame, but it doesn't, because it has no ability to randomize the setting. So let's undo that. Keep this randomizer. And we're done there. I'm going to commit that. See if I have any stray white space or anything like that before I commit. This looks fine. I did not mention that this is also provided by libtil. It's just a little helper. We can look at the source for that. So it's just a really simple hex conversion. So we didn't have to implement that. Another thing that's probably worth mentioning, let's go back to checkers. So because checkers is a more complex setup, it requires a free function for the setup. When you don't provide a free function, here, to till setup new, you just provide null, which is what happened here. Provided null there. The till setup instance just gets freed with regular libc free for you. You don't have to provide like we don't have to provide like this kind of thing. It just assumes that that's what you want. But when you have a more complex till setup structure that has basically pointers to something. It holds references to other stuff. Like you need a more deep free, then you need to implement one and provide it. Like checkers here, since it can use a fill module, it has a nested setup for that module. And when you implement these, you do need to be careful about possibly receiving a null pointer for the free, it appears. I'm not actually sure if that's true. That looks like unnecessary defensive programming. Let's take a look at that. Context free. Until setup free. Yeah, that looks unnecessary. Because if the setup was null, it just wouldn't even get past here. Yeah, I don't think this is needed. I'll have to check that in later. I guess that's it. And the next natural thing to add would be a module context. But let's just end this video here. It gets another step towards all the complexity you can have in a rototiller module. Make sure that still compiles. Yeah. Alright, that's it. Bye.